Shalom from Israel, I'm Ariel Ben Amram. This week we will reflect on the second chapter of the book of Psalms. And let's start. Verse 1. Why are the nations in uproar? And why do the people mutter in vain? Verse second verse. The kings of the earth stand up, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. We wanted to read the two verses back to back because of course they are related. In other words, if we leave the first verse by itself, we wouldn't really understand what is the context when it says, why are the nations in uproar? Like unresting, like not happy, like claiming, like fighting for something, like unsettled. And why do the peoples mutter in vain? What is that they doing? What is that they think? What is that they say that is in vain? So we have to really pay attention to every word because, of course, sometimes there are words that apparently they don't need to be or to add to what is already been said. But in this case, the semantics are very important. So King David asked himself, why are the nations in uproar? Against what are they racing? It's like evidently he's talking about his enemies. You know, he's a king of Israel, and he's talking about his enemies. So why the nations, meaning the neighboring nations against Israel, are in uproar? So, and why they do that in vain? That's a key part of it, in vain. It's like, in other words, it is a vainful or vain reason why they are in uproar. They don't seem to have a reason. The reason is vain. Again, we have to go back to the first chapter that we discussed last week, because this implies an ethical approach, an ethical understanding about what we're talking about here. And the ethics is about complaining and being in uproar or against in vain. We have said many times in our blog and in our videos, in the commentaries that we made on the Torah, that vanity is something related to ego's fantasies and illusions. So we're talking about specific traits and qualities that when we're talking about the nations, we're talking about specific traits in behavior. Specifically the nations that are mentioned in the Torah. And in this particular case, the neighboring nations of Israel. They used to be 7, and they represent 7 negative qualities in consciousness. In our blog, we if you look in the search bar, the nations, we did a commentary, we wrote a commentary defining what are the meanings of the nations, the inner meanings, what they represent. So of course, when King David approached them, it's like they're in uproar in vain, they're muttering in vain. It's because these qualities are part of the futile and that part in consciousness what we want that is vain, that is futile, that is temporary, that is ephemeral, that doesn't transcend in consciousness. That's why we oppose love's ways and attributes against egos, fantasies, and illusions. Because what really transcends in consciousness is love. Because we are an extension of God's love. We are an emanation of God's love. Therefore, God's love manifested in the material world is the love as we know it. As the emotion, as the ethical principle, as a feeling, as a passion, and as an approach to life. Versus egos, fantasies, and illusions, which are temporary, egotistic, that's why they are egos, fantasies, and illusions. They pursue a temporary satisfaction or fulfillment that doesn't transcend, it's not permanent, as love, which is the reason and purpose of our existence. That is transcendental. We come from love in order to express and manifest love and beyond. Love is our source. That's why we insist that love is our true essence and identity. That's what makes us alive. That is what sustains us. So King David in this particular situation is saying, you guys, speaking to the nations, why are you so unrestful about? After all, your unrest, your uproar is based on vanity. That's the question. Verse 1 of the 2nd chapter. Now he adds, King David adds to this, put it in context. He said, the kings of the earth. It's interesting. We're talking about the earth, the local earth. Okay, meaning the land of Israel. It's talking about Aretz. It's not talking about Olam. It's not talking about the whole planet. So he specifically is talking about the kings of the neighboring nations. Stand up, meaning they are determined and stubborn about their attitude, about what they want to impose against Israel. In this case, we're talking about how those that echoes in our consciousness. So we're talking about what the nations want to impose, what this negative traits in consciousness want to impose in our behavior, in our thinking, in our feelings, in our passions, and even in our instincts. So the kings of the earth stand up and the rulers takes counsel together. In other words, they're all of them in the same page. Meaning, let's talk about this again. What the neighboring nations of Israel represent. So we're talking about cruelty, we're talking about indifference, we're talking about indolence, we're talking about coveting, greed, anger, and arrogance. That's 7. And if you pay attention, as we mentioned in the blog, all of them are related. The arrogant person is indifferent. The person who is indifferent is basically angry. Why? Because he's separating him or herself from his surroundings. He's different. Therefore, is indifferent. Meaning, I don't relate to that. I'm on my own space. Same thing goes to greed, coveting, basically the same. And cruelty as the result of that approach, of those feelings. So that receiving counseling together, they form part of the same negative trends in consciousness. So when we are coveting, lust, actually, we miss one lust instead of cruelty, so that's 7 in total. Cruelty is like the general consequence or effect or outcome of them. So when we lust, when we covet, when we are greedy, we're basically acting in the same way. The approach is the same. It's wanting to fulfill a lack based on a belief or feeling of lack. It's like, I need this, I want this. What do you need for? Because I want it, I need it. It's from where? But he has it, I don't. I want to have it too. Oh, okay, it's coveting. But the desire comes out of a feeling or belief of lack. So they take counsel together. They all belong to the same dimension, the same category, against the Lord. So the counseling, the attitude, the reason of being is against God. Now we have to understand, how are these nations against God? Because God represents exactly the opposite of those qualities. That's the meaning. It's very simple, by the way. So when we have said many times that when the Torah and the Hebrew Bible is talking about the name of God, it's talking about the hand of God, it's talking about attributes that the Torah is telling us that belongs to God, they're all positive and against anything that is negative. So in this case, the council of the nations are all of them against the Lord, against God. In this case, God's ways and attributes, because he's not a person. But this is a more important adding thing that David Hamelech, King David, is pointing out. He said, against the Lord and against his anointed. His king. His king in the land, in Israel. It's like they're against God, they're also against Israel, basically. That's what it means. So in this case, King David represents, his anointed represents the material manifestation of God's will on earth. That's what Israel represents, by the way. Now, our sages refer to this particular verse when he's talking his anointed. He's talking about also not just King David in his times, but also in the Messianic times. The anointed one is the Mashiach. Actually, the word Mashiach, that's the meaning. It means anointed, anointed with oil. The shemen is oil. So Mashiach is the one who was being anointed with oil. It's a quality in order to distinguish the person with a particular status, in this case a royal status. So he's anointed is king in Israel. So the Torah says in several instances that the enemies of Israel are God's enemies. And our prophets say the same, and the Talmud, the Oral Torah, expounds about that. Why? Because we are in the same page with God. We are together with God. So that's the context. So let's continue. Verse 3. And David Hamelech quotes the nation saying in verse 3, "Let us break their bands asunder and cast away the cords from us." Verse 4, "He that sits in heaven laughed. The Lord has them in derision." Verse 5, "Then will he speak unto them in his wrath and affright them in his sore displeasure." So the counsel of the kings is, we want to cast away, we want to separate. We don't want to be the way God wants humankind to be. We don't want to be like Israel, which represents what God wants. in the world as the model for humankind. They want to rebel against that. But then he that sits in heaven laughed. So God is the creator. Just like in this case, we cannot understand like the enemies are against God, and God is afraid of the nations and what's gonna happen with God. Oh wow, God has enemies. He says, excuse me. God is the creator of all. He created them. Now the philosophical question that we have to ask is like, if God created the nations, these negative trends in consciousness that are against his will, why he created them if they are against his will? Again, we have to understand that in an inner way in order to exercise and also in order to understand free will. For us to have free will, we need to have two or more options to choose from. Otherwise, we don't have free will. So what God created when he created darkness, negativity, the nations, the negative trends and traits in consciousness, they exist as a reference for us not to be them, have them, or manifest them. They exist as references, not as choices. We have repeated this many, many ways in our blog. So that's the idea. So when God has this covenant with Israel, it's like the rest of humankind, they do not see goodness. They are motivated by negative trends in consciousness. They are against the will that God wants to make prevail, which is making goodness prevail. No. That's why we have to conquer the nations. That's why we have to submit the nations for the sake of goodness. So it's not like a conquering desire. We really have to overcome them. And it's a commandment by God, by the way. That's the reason. He that sits in heaven laughs. Of course. The Lord has them in derision. Then will he speak unto them in his wrath, we will explain that, and affright them in his sore, this painful displeasure. Now, we're not talking about, again, all these references to God are attributes. We're not talking about a wrathful God or anything like that. We have to translate that, and we have done that thoroughly for more than 5 years in our blog, to explain the jealousy of God, the wrath of God. It's basically our separation from him. That's his wrath. That's his jealousy. That's his anger. It's like we are part of him, but we separate from him. The separation is the pain, the fear, the suffering, and actually our anger too. We're angry when we feel separated, when we don't want things that we want. When we don't have things that we want, we get angry. So in this case, we're not talking about that God is angry because he doesn't have what he wants. No. It's a metaphorical way that the Hebrew Bible uses to point out the consequences of our separation from God. That's his anger. So he's basically saying, and then he will speak them to the nations with his wrath, it's like separation, and affright them in his sore displeasure. They will feel the emptiness, the void of not being connected with God. And in this case, God's will, God's ways and attributes. He's saying, here we have goodness. You guys, the nations, you are not living through by for goodness. If you don't do that, the suffering would be and the displeasure would be major. Which that's what we see, by the way, when people are so engaging in their consciousness, in their negative thing, in the depression, in the anger, in the frustration. They suffer. We suffer. We are not fulfilled. We feel the emptiness. Then we're angry about that. And then we will ease that anger and that suffering and that pain when we return to the goodness of love's ways and attributes as the material manifestation of God's love. They will be free. So that's the context of the commandment of God to Israel to be a light for the nations. See, like the nation has the chance to know what goodness is and to live their ways and be happy. So, in this, we have to get back again to his anointed, because his anointed is talking about the messianic consciousness, and this is the messianic consciousness, by the way. This consciousness in which everything, the only pursuit of humankind and human consciousness will be goodness. But this apart in our consciousness, these negative traits and trends in consciousness that hold us back. Say, no, let's stay here, let's get addicted to pain, to frustration, to anger, to coveting, to greed, to lust. It's fine. Yeah, we know it's not fine. We know that. But we have to be strong enough to make the choice. Okay, let's continue then with verse 6. And in this case, God is speaking. So King David is quoting God. He said, "Truly, it is I that have established my king upon Zion, my holy mountain." So in other words, God is reiterating his covenant with Israel and with Israel's king. So again we read, "Truly it is I that have established my king upon Zion, my holy mountain." We have to repeat again, we have said this many times and we will say it many times, that Zion, Jerusalem, the temple of Jerusalem, represents our connection, an eternal bond with God. That's what it means. So this is, it's not random that King David is quoting God saying that this bond is established in God's holy mountain in Zion. This is very essential. It's capital importance. This, and truly, it is I that have established my kingdom upon Zion, my holy mountain. Because that's exactly the kingdom. When we connect with God's majesty, what's God's kingdom? His will manifest. What is His will manifest? Goodness. That's His revealed presence in the material world. Verse 7, "I will tell of the decree. The Lord said unto me, You are my son. This day have I begotten you." Verse 8, "Ask of me, and I will give the nations for your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession." So, King David is answering God's quote. In verse 7 saying, "I will tell of the decree. The Lord said unto me," God told me, "You are my son. This day have I begotten you." Ask of me, and I will give the nations for your inheritance and the ends of the earth for your possession. Now, we have to understand that this is for people who have this crooked, misunderstood conception about what Zionism means, by the way. It's like Zionists want to conquer the world, to possess the world. This is not what it is. Now you may say, hey, you just mentioned King David saying, ask of me and I will give the nations for your inheritance and the end of the world for your possession. We're talking about a contextual inheritance. What is the context? Goodness, God's will. So this is not Israel's desire. It's God's will. And God's will is the goodness that He wants to prevail into the nations and all the corners of the world. That's what if we ask for. It's like we as His inheritance, the member of His pact. We are the one who's supposed to, not supposed to, but commanded to make His will prevail on earth. And we start that with the nations. That's what is that order, the nations and then the rest of the world. It's not about conquering the world. Historically, if you see Israel haven't conquered any nations. All the nations want to destroy Israel, but not all the way around. We're not interested in conquering Syria, Egypt, or Iraq, or the Orient, or Africa, or South America. Absolutely not. But the mission that we have is to tell our neighbors, Africa, Latin America, the rest of the world, what is the truth about human consciousness. And that truth is in the Torah. It's decreed by God. It's not our decree. And again, the decree is goodness. Make goodness prevail on earth. That's the point. So this is not about a political agenda. This is not about a ideological agenda or personal agenda or material agenda. This is about making love prevail in every level of consciousness. And that's the inner meaning of this. You have to change, conquer the nations. Conquering the nation is like conquering the negative traits and trends in consciousness. That's what it means. And also in every aspect of life, which is every corner of the earth. So in this context, earth represents life. We are a microcosmos of the planet. Planet is alive. It has life and sustains life. Okay. Verse 9. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. So, God is telling us, if you ask, meaning if we ask God in His eternal, infinite, loving kindness and truth, God, I want to conquer every negative trend and trace and aspect of my consciousness. Help me. Say, hey, I will help you to do that. So we have just to ask. Now, it's not outside somewhere high in heaven, in the sky. No. It's inside of us. We have to appeal to God's love within ourselves, which is our soul. As we mentioned before, our essence and true identity. And then once we recognize that that's the source from where all existence comes from, then it will be available for us in our consciousness. And He will help us manifest that essence, that inner essence, the source from which all comes from. So we just have, by asking, it's just recognizing. It's not asking for something that we don't have. We have it already. We just need to acknowledge that the goodness that we are is God's goodness also, that He puts on us. So, and he's telling us, if you ask, you shall break them. They don't say he, we. Let's pay attention to the semantics here. Because He may say, you ask me and I will do it for you. No, we have to. We have to come to the awareness of our true identity. We say, this is me. I'm not indifferent. I'm not indolent. I'm not coveting. I'm not full of lust. I'm not that. I'm love. That's what made me alive. And then live accordingly, by love's ways and attributes. That's the idea. So, and you shall break them with a rod of iron. The rod of iron is the symbolic meaning of iron in the Hebrew Bible. Has two meanings actually. One is violence. So the iron, the sword and the iron usually go together. They're synonyms. But it's a violence that we have to understand, by the way. It's not being violent for being violent. It's being ruthless against things that are negative. That's the ruthlessness of the sword, of the iron, the density, the heaviness, the strength of iron. It's like the determination. One see a sword, it's like we see not just the physical artifact. We saw the determination. It implies the determination to cut. We see a knife, for instance, in our kitchen. We see the object, we know that the object is destined to cut. It's like that's his determination, his purpose. With a rod of iron. It's like long, like extending this determination. You will break them into pieces, like a potter's vessel. You break. So they will not serve any purpose anymore. They will be pieces of nothing. It's useless. And again, we're talking about the nations as the negative traits and trends in consciousness that we need to break down with the determination, with the iron rod of our will. Okay, then verse 10 say, now therefore, O you kings, be wise, be admonished, you judges of the earth. Why the judges? Because they judge our behavior. By judging, it's not about you're wrong, you're right. It's like making so. Ruling. The ruling of a judge, that means judging. So it's not judging that you're bad, no. This is not a value judgment. We're talking about the way we are. Judges of the earth. It's like that which make us behave or have manifest in our consciousness. Those are the judges, the habits, the ideologies, the ideas, the principles, the values. Those are judging ourselves. They're ruling our acts, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, our passions, our instincts. So, be wise, be admonished, so like be warned. I mean, like get wise. All kings, king and judges, rulers. So that the symbolic meanings are clear. Like, act accordingly, be wise. you who judge and rule the earth, life. 11. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Serve the Lord with fear. Fear in this case is reverence. Yeah, there are two meanings, we know. We have to be afraid of God. Oh, something's going to happen to me if I don't do His will. It's one thing, which we have talked about many times in the blog. But the real meaning is be aware of God. That's what is the fear of God. It's like when we know, have an idea based on the Torah of God's ways and attributes. It's like, wow, Gadol, big. The awe of God. It's like I'm His creation, so tiny, tiny, tiny compared to the vast size of His creation we're not able to grasp in all these infinite dimensions. Then we say, wow, that's the fear of God. It's like, so serve the Lord with fear. I mean, serving the Lord is like, once we get this idea about God, based on our limited understanding, a possibility to conceive something, when we serve Him, it's like, I am your creature, God. I want to serve your purpose. That's serving God, by the way. It's like, what is your will? Then so be it. I'm your creature. That's all. Reverence. Like accepting the fact that we are not our own creation, that we were created by God. Therefore, we owe Him servitude. It's very simple. It's not complicated. Unless our egos are so inflated that we say, no way, I'm going to do what I feel, what I want to do. Based on what? The beginning of the chapter, vanities, the turmoil, the uproar of the nations. That's the boiling of the ego, by the way. It's me, I want more, this is my way. Forget about God's way, this is my way. What makes us feel that way? It's not the Torah. It's not God's ways and attributes. Which ones? Negative trends and traits in consciousness based on these negative qualities called the nations that we're referring to here. So, and rejoice with trembling. It's interesting, rejoice with trembling. So we vibrate of joy. So serving God is not an obligation that is just like a burden that some people feel or think of. It's like once we see, we understand, we grasp God based on His ways and attributes and how the Torah is teaching us, instructing us about Him. Then we say it would be a privilege and honor to have in my consciousness the ability to serve you without questioning anything. It would be an honor, a privilege, a rejoice. Then we serve Him with joy. It's like we are fully aware that we are His creation and we depend on His will because He gives us life and He sustains us every moment. So we have to be humble enough, and King David will talk about that in his book of Psalms many times. It's the key to understand this awe of God. It's like when we see that we are microscopic, like infinitesimally small. And we say, wow. And I'm so happy that you created me in the middle of these countless things that you have created. And then you see me and you think of me and you care for me. Then the joy comes up. Like, wow, God loves me. He gave me life. I'm here. Like, wow. Then I'm happy. to manifest my true essence and identity, which is God's will. That's it. It's very simple. So verse 12, which is the last verse of chapter 2, and with this we end our commentary, says the following: pay homage in purity, lest he be angry in God, and you perish in the way, when suddenly his wrath is kindled. Lighten. Happy are they that take refuge in him. We were saying before with different words. But let's elaborate a little bit. Do homage in purity. What is purity here? Exactly what we were referring before. Acting based on love's ways and attributes. That's purity. Nothing negative is the motivation. Nothing negative is behind. Only the goodness is our cause, motivation, and purpose. Okay, so this is purity. Purity is not, oh, I'm pure, I'm coming in purity. No. We have to act and be and manifest and have in goodness. That's our purity. If we come with a different agenda, egos, fantasies, and illusions, then that's not pure. That's lust, coveting, indifference, indolence, anger, haughtiness. That's not purity. Lest he be angry, meaning if you come with this separating agenda, God will be separated also. That's his anger, the separation as we mentioned before. So if we're not pure, meaning we don't come in his terms, he's not going to be there. Why? Because he doesn't blend with anything different than his ways and attributes. The fact that he created negativity doesn't necessarily mean that he's negative. So we have to clear that also, because some people say, oh, because he created negativity, then we can have cult to negativity and become an idol and be negative too. He created negativity. Why not? It's a matter of choice. We can choose that. No. It's a reference to choose goodness, purity. Goodness in this is the context of purity. Lest he be angry, meaning he's not going to blend with us if we come with the wrong attitude. He won't. It's going to be us with ourselves. The Talmud says, we have quoted this many times. He saying, the arrogant cannot sit, God cannot sit with the arrogant. So why? Because the arrogant is full of himself. That's it. So the sages start asking, so what he means by that? Jesus, God doesn't like arrogant people. He doesn't want to sit with them, pure. He said, no. He wants to sit with him. But the problem is that the arrogant is so full of himself that he doesn't leave a little space for God to be with him. That's the meaning of it. It's like, he has an agenda, I don't like this guy, I don't want to sit with him. Look, he's so arrogant. No. Say, God, this guy is my creature. I love him. I wish I could be with him, sitting next to him. And they say, God, you know what? Stay where you are. I'm with myself. Fine, I don't need you. Therefore, God cannot sit with him. Even if he wants. I mean, it's God. It's like, we are telling God, you know what? Forget it. I'm full with myself. I'm full of myself. I don't need you. I don't have a space for you. I'm full of myself. That's the meaning. So this is the anger of God. This is not angry because we're separating from him. That's his anger. And you, referring to people, plural, perish in the way. In other words, there's a point in which we get exhausted living in egos, fantasies, and illusions. Doesn't make sense anymore, life. We just live to fulfill fantasies and illusions based on consumer society, politically correct, light culture, sophistication, whatever, glamour. And then we die in the way. What dies in the way? A true essence and identity, which never dies, but is diminished drastically with a different agenda. We suffocate our essence and identity, our own love. We enslaved our love, our essence, to egos, fantasies, and illusions. This is perishing in the way. The way is the lifetime. the lifespan. That's the way we walk. When suddenly his wrath is kindled, it's like when his wrath is kindled, it's like when we are separated completely from him. We perish. Eventually, we're gonna get to Psalm number 90. By the way, King David quotes or gives credit to that particular psalm to Moses. He will mention that in your wrath were consumed, and in your anger were destroyed. It's true. That's why when we get there, we expand a little bit. One of our favorite psalms, by the way. It's true. In your wrath we are destroyed, and in your anger we are consumed. We perish. We don't exist. Why? Because we're separated from you. We're not connected with you, God. Happy, it ends the chapter 2. Happy are those or they that take refuge, shelter in him. This is the bottom line of all that we have studied today. We have to make God our house. That Zion. That's what it is. That's our refuge. Our refuge is our bond and permanent connection with God, the permanent awareness of our connection with God. That's our refuge. Happy are those that take refuge in him. It's our Creator. Imagine the privilege of being in his house. Happy are those who live in your house. They will praise you eternally, of course. That's the whole point of this commentary, is to get us closer to living this consciousness of oneness with God. And we do that by creating this empathy, this alliance, this covenant with goodness, and make it goodness lead every aspect, dimension, a trait of our consciousness and of life. So with this, we finish the second chapter for this week. We wish you an amazingly, enormously blessed week. Shabbat Shalom. And until next week.